A Heart of Gold. Jasmine Daniels woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The soft morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her small bedroom, casting a warm glow over the modest space. At 16, she had lived a life filled with uncertainties, bouncing between foster homes, always wondering where she truly belonged. She sat up slowly, her eyes landing on a worn-out photograph resting on her bedside table. It was a picture of her younger self, grinning widely next to Mrs. Taylor, the kind-hearted director of the orphanage where she had spent most of her childhood. The image, slightly faded at the edges, was one of her most treasured possessions. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine swung her legs over the side of the bed and stretched. Today was just another day. Another routine morning before school, another walk to the orphanage where she volunteered whenever she could. She wasn't required to go, but she felt drawn to the children there, perhaps because she had once been one of them, desperate for a sense of stability in a world that often felt too big, too uncaring. She stood and walked to her dresser, pulling out a simple t-shirt and jeans. As she got dressed, a familiar doubt crept into her mind. Am I really making a difference? Sure, she spent time with the kids, helped them with their homework, played games with them, and listened when they needed to talk. But was that enough? She dreamed of doing something bigger, something meaningful, but with no clear path to college and no stable family to support her. Her dreams felt distant, like stars just out of reach. Pushing those thoughts aside, Jasmine grabbed her backpack and headed downstairs. Her foster mother, Miss Evelyn, was already in the kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee. "Morning, Jasmine," Miss Evelyn greeted warmly. "You heading to the orphanage before school?" Jasmine nodded. "Yeah, I just like to check in before classes start." Miss Evelyn smiled knowingly and handed her a small bag. "I packed you some snacks for the kids. I know how much they love treats." Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude. Miss Evelyn wasn't perfect. No foster parent was. But she was kind and tried her best to make Jasmine feel at home. "Thanks, Miss Evelyn," Jasmine said, giving her a small smile before heading out. The walk to the orphanage was a short one, lined with old brick buildings and scattered trees that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The town was small, the kind of place where people recognized each other, but didn't necessarily stop to chat. Jasmine often felt like she blended into the background, just another face in the crowd. As she neared the orphanage, the familiar sounds of laughter and playful screams filled the air. The moment she stepped through the gate, she was greeted by a group of children rushing toward her. "Jasmine's here," a little girl with pigtails squealed. "Hey, guys." Jasmine laughed, bending down to hug the children who clung to her legs. Their small arms wrapped tightly around her, a reminder that even if she sometimes felt lost, she was important to them. Mrs. Taylor appeared at the doorway, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her warm brown eyes crinkled with a smile as she walked toward Jasmine. "Good to see you, sweetheart," Mrs. Taylor said, pulling her into a brief hug. "These little ones were just asking about you." Jasmine smiled. "I thought I'd come by and help out before school." Mrs. Taylor squeezed her shoulder. "You always do more than you realize, Jasmine." Jasmine wanted to believe that, but the lingering doubts in her heart made it difficult. Still, she pushed them aside and spent the next hour helping the children with their morning activities. She read to the younger kids, helped one of the older boys with a difficult math problem, and even played a quick game of tag before she had to leave for school. As she left the orphanage, she felt lighter, but the uncertainty still lingered. What am I meant to do with my life? Will I ever truly belong somewhere? With these thoughts clouding her mind, she almost missed the reminder buzzing on her phone, a text from Miss Evelyn. "Don't forget to stop by the grocery store after school to pick up the groceries I listed. Have a good day, sweetheart." Jasmine sighed. She didn't mind running errands, but grocery shopping felt like another task in a long list of responsibilities she hadn't signed up for. Still, she put her phone away and headed toward school, determined to push through the day. After school, Jasmine made her way to the small grocery store a few blocks from her foster home. The automatic doors whooshed open as she stepped inside, the cool air offering a slight relief from the afternoon heat. She pulled out the crumpled shopping list Miss Evelyn had given her and grabbed a small basket. As she made her way through the aisles, picking up bread, milk, and a few vegetables, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. Then, in the snack aisle, she saw him. An elderly man stood by the biscuit shelves, his hands carefully feeling along the packages. His white cane tapped lightly against the floor as he muttered to himself. Jasmine hesitated. It was clear he was struggling to find something, but would he accept help from her? She wasn't used to approaching strangers, especially not in a place as mundane as a grocery store. Still, she couldn't just walk away. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you need help finding something?" The old man turned toward her voice, his expression surprised at first before softening into a smile. "Oh, hello there. That's very kind of you. I'm looking for my favorite oatmeal biscuits. Golden Oats. They come in a blue box with gold lettering." Jasmine quickly scanned the shelves. After a moment, her eyes landed on the package, just slightly out of his reach. "I found them," she said, grabbing the box and placing it in his hands. The old man's face lit up as he ran his fingers over the familiar packaging. "Ah, yes. This is it. Thank you, my dear. These biscuits mean more to me than you might imagine." Jasmine's curiosity piqued. "Really? Why's that?" A wistful smile crossed his face. "My late wife, Martha, loved these biscuits. Every Sunday afternoon, we'd sit on our porch swing, sharing a pack of golden oats with a pot of tea. It became our little tradition." His voice grew softer. "She used to dunk hers in the tea a little too long. It would always break apart, and she'd laugh, calling it biscuit soup." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. "That sounds really nice." "It was," the old man said with a fond chuckle. "Now every time I have these biscuits, it feels like she's still with me." Jasmine hesitated before speaking. "I never really knew my parents, but the people at the orphanage where I grew up, they're like family to me. Even just walking inside and smelling the place brings back memories." The old man nodded. "Family isn't just about blood, my dear. It's about the people who care for us, who shape us, who make us feel like we belong." Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest. For a moment, the loneliness that had weighed on her all day seemed to lift. "You have a kind heart," the old man said, patting her hand gently. "Don't ever lose that." Jasmine smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "Thank you." As he walked away with his biscuits tucked safely under his arm, Jasmine stood still for a moment, absorbing the interaction. She had only helped him find a box of biscuits, but the warmth in his voice, the gratitude in his smile, it felt like something much bigger. Little did she know, that simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. A gift beyond measure. Jasmine spent the rest of her grocery trip in a daze, her thoughts still lingering on her conversation with the elderly man. There was something about him, his presence, his kindness, that had left a lasting impact. As she placed the last few items in her basket and made her way to the checkout line, she found herself wondering, would I ever see him again? She didn't even know his name. By the time she got home, Miss Evelyn was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of sautéed onions and garlic filled the air, wrapping around Jasmine like a warm hug. "You're back later than I expected," Miss Evelyn said, glancing over her shoulder. "Everything all right?" Jasmine set the grocery bags on the counter. "Yeah, just took a little longer than usual. I met someone at the store." Miss Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Oh, a friend?" Jasmine hesitated. "Not exactly. Just an older man who needed some help. He was blind and trying to find his favorite biscuits. I helped him, and we ended up talking for a bit." Miss Evelyn turned off the stove and wiped her hands on a dish towel. "That was kind of you," she said with a small smile. Did he tell you anything interesting? Jasmine nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table. Yeah, he told me about his wife, how they used to eat those biscuits together every Sunday. It was just a small thing, but the way he talked about her, I don't know. It made me think about how important little moments can be. Miss Evelyn's expression softened. It's funny, isn't it? How strangers can sometimes teach us the most valuable lessons. Jasmine nodded, staring down at the wooden tabletop. Yeah, it made me wonder if my parents had any little traditions like that. She rarely spoke about her parents. She had no real memories of them, only fragments of stories she'd overheard from foster care records and caseworkers. Miss Evelyn reached out and squeezed Jasmine's hand. Even if you don't know their traditions, you can create your own. You have so much kindness in you, Jasmine. Maybe that's your legacy. Jasmine wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, she nodded, helping Miss Evelyn put away the groceries before retreating to her small bedroom. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. The man, his warmth, his gratitude, had touched something deep within her. But she had no way of knowing that this small moment would come back to change everything. A mysterious letter. The next morning, Jasmine woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggily, she reached for it, expecting a reminder about school or a text from Miss Evelyn. But instead, she found a notification from the orphanage. Jasmine, please come see me as soon as you can. Mrs. Taylor. Her stomach twisted. Was something wrong? Without wasting any time, she quickly got dressed, grabbed her backpack, and headed out. By the time she reached the orphanage, the morning air was crisp and fresh. Children ran around the front yard, their laughter ringing through the air. But Jasmine barely noticed. Her mind was focused on Mrs. Taylor's message. As she stepped inside, she spotted Mrs. Taylor in her office, sorting through a thick stack of paperwork. The older woman looked up the moment Jasmine appeared in the doorway. Jasmine, dear, come in. Her voice was warm, but carried an undertone of urgency. Jasmine sat down across from her, nerves prickling at the back of her neck. Is something wrong? Mrs. Taylor hesitated for a moment before sliding an envelope across the desk toward her. This came in the mail this morning. It's addressed to you. Jasmine blinked. Me. She wasn't used to receiving mail, especially not at the orphanage. With slightly shaky fingers, she picked up the envelope. It was thick, made of expensive paper, and her name was written in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. She turned it over, searching for a return address, but there was none. Curiosity buzzed through her as she carefully tore it open. Inside, she found a folded letter, and her breath caught. A cashier's check. Jasmine's heart pounded as she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the words. Dear Jasmine, your kindness in the grocery store touched my heart more than you may realize. The simple act of helping a stranger find a familiar comfort brought me back to a time when kindness was abundant, when small gestures carried great meaning. I have lived a long life, filled with moments both joyful and heartbreaking. But the world often forgets that even those of us who have walked its roads for decades still long for warmth, for a reminder that we are seen. You saw me, and in that moment, you reminded me that kindness is not lost, that small gestures still have great power. This gift is my way of saying thank you, not just for finding a box of biscuits, but for reminding me that people like you still exist. I hope this helps you in ways you never imagined. Sincerely, a friend. Jasmine's hands trembled as she read the letter again. Then, almost afraid to look, she turned her attention to the check, and nearly dropped it. The number printed on the slip of paper was staggering. More money than she had ever seen in her life. More than she could have ever imagined having. Mrs. Taylor, she whispered, her throat dry. This isn't real, is it? Mrs. Taylor's eyes glistened as she reached out and gently squeezed Jasmine's hand. It's very real, dear, and it's in your name. Jasmine could barely breathe. But why me? I just helped him find some biscuits. I didn't do anything special." Mrs. Taylor gave her a knowing look. "To you, it may have been a small thing. But to him, it meant everything." Jasmine shook her head in disbelief, staring at the letter, at the check, at the proof that a single act of kindness had led to something far beyond her understanding. "What do I even do with this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Taylor smiled. "That's for you to decide. But something tells me you'll use it well." Jasmine wasn't so sure. The idea of having this much money in her name felt overwhelming. And though she had no way of knowing for certain, she had a feeling deep in her heart that she knew who the mysterious friend was. Mr. Carter. Could he really have done this? A blind elderly man with nothing but his biscuits and his memories. Jasmine didn't know, but she intended to find out. As she left Mrs. Taylor's office, the letter still clutched tightly in her hand. A new determination settled in her heart. She would not waste this gift. She would not let his faith in her go unanswered. A search for answers. Jasmine made up her mind. She needed to find Mr. Carter. She needed to thank him. She returned to the grocery store that afternoon, scanning the aisles, her heart racing. But he wasn't there. She went back the next day, and the next. Each time she searched, but there was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished. Jasmine wasn't sure what she had expected, that he would be waiting for her, that he would step forward and admit to everything. But the more she searched, the more she realized that perhaps this wasn't about finding him. Perhaps it was about something more. She clutched the letter in her pocket, staring up at the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. What now? The answer came quietly. She would use this gift, not just for herself, but for the place that had given her a home when she had none. The orphanage. Jasmine took a deep breath. She didn't have all the answers. She might never find Mr. Carter again. But one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. Ripples of change. The letter never left Jasmine's side. She carried it with her, folded neatly in her pocket, as though holding onto it would keep her connected to the mysterious stranger who had seen something in her that she could barely see in herself. The check, safely tucked away in a drawer at the orphanage, remained untouched. She couldn't bring herself to spend a single cent. Not yet. Because she had a mission now. She needed to find Mr. Carter. For days, Jasmine retraced her steps through the small town, stopping by the grocery store at different hours, lingering near the snack aisle, hoping for a glimpse of the blind old man who had changed her life with a conversation about biscuits. But he was never there. She asked around. The cashiers, the store manager, even some of the regular shoppers she had seen before. No one seemed to know him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The weight of a gift. One afternoon, after another fruitless search, Jasmine returned to the orphanage. She found Mrs. Taylor in her office, going through stacks of paperwork. Still no luck. Mrs. Taylor asked gently, glancing up from the files. Jasmine shook her head, dropping into the chair across from her. It's like he was never really there to begin with. Mrs. Taylor chuckled. Sometimes people come into our lives for just a moment, and that moment is all we get, but it can change everything. Jasmine sighed, running a hand through her thick curls. I don't even know what I'd say to him if I found him. Thanks for the life-changing donation. Oh, and also why me? Mrs. Taylor leaned forward, her eyes kind. You don't need to know why. You just need to decide what you're going to do with it. Jasmine glanced toward the drawer where the check was safely locked away. It felt like a mountain of responsibility. More money than she had ever dreamed of. And yet, she had no idea how to use it. If it were you, Jasmine said hesitantly, what would you do? Mrs. Taylor leaned back, tapping her pen against the desk thoughtfully. Well, if it were me, I'd ask myself, what matters most to me? What's the one thing I've always wanted to change? Jasmine was silent for a long moment. She thought about the children at the orphanage, the peeling paint on the walls, the broken swing set in the playground, the tiny library with shelves half empty, books worn from years of use. She thought about the kids who clung to her every time she visited, who looked up to her like she was something more than just another teenager who had been in and out of the system. She thought about herself, about what she had needed when she was younger. I think. Jasmine took a deep breath, sitting up straighter. I think I want to use it for the orphanage. Mrs. Taylor smiled. I thought you might say that. The plan takes shape. The next day, Jasmine sat at the dining table in her foster home, scribbling furiously in a notebook. A list. Things the orphanage needs. Fix the playground. Renovate the bedrooms. No more broken beds. Get more books for the library. New desks for the study area. Fix the leaky roof in the dining hall. She bit her lip, staring at the words. Even with the donation, it felt like so much. Planning something big. Jasmine looked up to see Miss Evelyn watching her with a raised eyebrow, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Kind of, Jasmine admitted. I want to use the donation for the orphanage, but I don't even know where to start. Miss Evelyn set her mug down and took a seat across from her. You don't have to do it all alone, you know. People love to help when they see something good happening. Have you thought about reaching out to the community? Jasmine frowned. Like fundraising. Miss Evelyn nodded. Not just fundraising. Getting people involved. When people feel connected to a cause, they're more likely to support it, whether it's with money, time, or resources. If you really want to make an impact, don't just use the donation. Get the town involved. Jasmine sat back, considering. She had never thought of herself as a leader, but she wasn't just a girl from the orphanage anymore. She had a chance to make a real difference. Maybe she could do this. Rallying a town. The next morning, Jasmine walked into Mrs. Taylor's office with a determined look. I want to do a community project, she announced. Mrs. Taylor raised an eyebrow. Oh, I want to use the donation for the orphanage, but I don't want to do it alone. I want to get people involved. Volunteers, local businesses, maybe even the town government. A slow smile spread across Mrs. Taylor's face. That's quite the undertaking, Jasmine. I know, Jasmine exhaled, but I want to try. Mrs. Taylor studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right then. Let's start with a plan. Over the next few weeks, Jasmine poured herself into organizing the project. She reached out to local businesses, explaining her idea. Some offered donations, paint for the walls, books for the library, lumber for the playground. Others promised volunteers. The town's mayor even took an interest. This is a wonderful initiative, he told Jasmine when she met with him at City Hall. I'd love to help promote it. Would you be willing to speak at a community event? Jasmine hesitated. She had never spoken in front of a crowd before. The thought of standing on a stage, with all eyes on her, made her stomach twist. But then she thought about the orphanage, about the kids who looked up to her. She wasn't doing this for herself. Okay, she said, voice firm. I'll do it. A new purpose. The day of the event came faster than Jasmine expected. She stood backstage at the community center, heart pounding. The room beyond was filled with people, shop owners, teachers, parents, even some of her classmates from school. You ready? Mrs. Taylor asked beside her. Jasmine swallowed hard. I think so. Mrs. Taylor squeezed her hand. Just speak from the heart. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine stepped onto the stage. The microphone felt too big in her hands, the lights too bright. But then she saw them. The kids from the orphanage, sitting in the front row, their eyes filled with hope. And suddenly, the fear melted away. She cleared her throat. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine, and I grew up at the local orphanage. It's more than just a building to me. It's home. And right now, it needs help. She spoke about the children, about the repairs needed, about how the community could come together to make a difference. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Then, applause erupted. Jasmine blinked, stunned. People were standing, clapping, nodding in agreement. She had done it. She had started something real. As she stepped off the stage, Mrs. Taylor hugged her. "I am so proud of you, Jasmine." And for the first time, she felt proud of herself too. She still didn't know if she'd ever find Mr. Carter. But maybe she didn't need to. Because what he had given her, more than money, more than a donation, was a purpose. And she wasn't going to waste it. The spark that ignited a movement. Jasmine had never been the center of attention before. But after her speech at the community event, she quickly realized how powerful her voice could be. The very next morning, she woke to a flood of messages on her phone. Friends, classmates, even people she barely spoke to at school were reaching out. "That was amazing, Jasmine. How can I help? I had no idea the orphanage needed so much work. Count me in. Hey, I work at the hardware store. Maybe we can donate some supplies." Jasmine stared at the screen, overwhelmed. The night before, she had gone to bed still unsure if people had really taken her words to heart. Now, there was no doubt. Her small idea, a community effort to revamp the orphanage, had ignited something much bigger than she had expected. And she was no longer doing it alone. Building a team. Jasmine met with Mrs. Taylor that afternoon at the orphanage, her hands shaking with excitement as she laid out all the messages she had received. "This is happening," she said breathlessly. "People actually care." Mrs. Taylor smiled warmly, sipping her tea. "Of course they care, dear. They just needed someone to show them why it mattered." Jasmine nodded, still in disbelief. "So, what's the next step?" Mrs. Taylor asked. Jasmine bit her lip. She had spent so much time trying to raise awareness that she hadn't thought about the logistics of actually organizing the help. "Well, I guess we need a plan," Jasmine said, sitting up straighter. "We should figure out what needs to be done first, who can do what, and how we're going to manage supplies." Mrs. Taylor nodded. "You'll need a team of volunteers, someone to handle construction, another for painting, and another for organizing donations." Jasmine scribbled notes furiously. "I'll make a sign-up list and post it around town. Maybe we can hold a volunteer meeting here at the orphanage." "Excellent idea." Mrs. Taylor beamed. "And what about funding? The donation will help, but you may need more for unexpected costs." Jasmine paused. "I could set up a fundraiser. Maybe a bake sale. A community dinner." Mrs. Taylor chuckled. "Or all three." Jasmine's excitement grew. This was no longer just about her. This was about something bigger, something that could change lives, not just for the children at the orphanage, but for the entire town. And she was at the heart of it. The first meeting. 2 days later, the orphanage's small community room was packed. Jasmine had expected maybe a handful of volunteers, some of her classmates, maybe a few parents. But as she stepped to the front of the room, she saw dozens of people. Teachers, local business owners, parents, high school students, even seniors from the community center. Mrs. Taylor patted her shoulder. "They're all here because of you, dear. Go on. Talk to them." Jasmine took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Wow. I wasn't expecting such a big turnout," she admitted with a nervous laugh. The crowd chuckled, easing some of her tension. "First, I just want to say thank you," she continued, scanning the room. "This place means everything to me. And I know it means a lot to these kids, too. So if you're here, it means you care. And that means the world." She took a deep breath and launched into the plan. They needed builders to fix the playground, painters to brighten the dull, peeling walls, volunteers to sort donations, people to help with food for fundraisers. To Jasmine's amazement, hands shot up immediately. "I can help fix the roof," called out Mr. Porter, the owner of the local hardware store. "My daughter and I can organize books for the library," said a woman in the front row. "I run a bakery. We can donate cupcakes for the bake sale." Jasmine couldn't stop smiling. It was really happening. The work begins. The next weekend, the orphanage became a construction site. Volunteers poured in early in the morning, rolling up their sleeves and getting to work. Jasmine, dressed in old jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt, led a team of high school students in repainting the playroom. Music blasted from a speaker as they worked, laughing and chatting while transforming the dull beige walls into a bright, colorful mural. Outside, a group of parents and local builders worked to fix the swing set and jungle gym. Kids ran around excitedly, watching as the rusty old equipment was replaced with fresh new pieces. In the kitchen, a group of elderly volunteers prepared sandwiches and drinks for everyone. Even the mayor showed up. "This is quite the operation you've got going here," he said, nodding approvingly as he surveyed the work. "You've done something special, Jasmine." Jasmine felt a swell of pride. She wasn't just a girl from the orphanage anymore. She was someone who had started something, a familiar face in the crowd. As Jasmine stood outside, watching the volunteers work, something caught her eye. Or rather someone. An elderly man sat quietly on a bench near the playground, hands resting on his cane. He wasn't interacting with anyone, just sitting there, watching. But Jasmine knew exactly who he was. Her heart pounded. Mr. Carter. For a moment, she hesitated. What if she was wrong? What if he didn't remember her? What if? No. She had searched for him for weeks. And now he was here. Taking a deep breath, she walked over. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly. The old man turned slightly, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "I was wondering when you'd spot me." Jasmine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. You're here." "I am," he chuckled. "I heard something remarkable was happening at this old place and thought I'd take a look." Jasmine sat beside him, her mind racing with questions. "I tried to find you. I wanted to thank you. Did you really make the donation?" Mr. Carter's smile didn't fade, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, familiar blue box. "Golden Oats biscuits. Do you know why I love these so much?" he asked. Jasmine nodded. "Because they remind you of your wife." Mr. Carter chuckled. "That's true. But it's also because they remind me of kindness, of home, of little things that make life sweet." He turned toward her. "The day you helped me, you weren't just finding biscuits. You were seeing me, and that mattered." Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat. "I won't confirm or deny whether I had anything to do with that donation," Mr. Carter said, eyes twinkling. "But I will say this, you have a gift, Jasmine, not just for kindness, but for leadership, for making people believe in something greater than themselves." Jasmine swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know what to say." Mr. Carter smiled. "Then don't say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing." Jasmine glanced around at the orphanage, the volunteers, the laughter, the new life that was blossoming here. Maybe she didn't need an answer. Maybe she already had one. She turned back to Mr. Carter and smiled. "Would you like a tour?" she asked. He chuckled. "I'd love one." And as they stood and walked toward the orphanage together, Jasmine knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning, a legacy of kindness. Jasmine led Mr. Carter through the bustling orphanage, pointing out the changes that had already been made and sharing plans for what was still to come. She couldn't help but notice the quiet way he listened, taking in every detail as if this place meant something to him beyond just curiosity. "The playroom got a fresh coat of paint last weekend," Jasmine said, gesturing to the vibrant walls covered in colorful murals. Children's laughter echoed as they ran around, playing with new toys donated by the community. "The bedrooms are next. Some of the beds are old and falling apart, so we're replacing them." Mr. Carter nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You've done a remarkable thing here, Jasmine." Jasmine felt warmth spread in her chest at his words. She had never thought of herself as remarkable. But standing here, seeing all the people who had come together because of an idea she had sparked, she was beginning to believe it. As they continued walking, Jasmine hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind. "Mr. Carter, do you have any connection to this place?" The old man stopped walking, resting a hand on the cane in front of him. He let out a small sigh, his expression thoughtful. "I do," he admitted after a long pause. "Many years ago, my wife and I used to visit. We didn't have children of our own, so we would come here, spend time with the kids, bring little gifts, read stories." He chuckled. Margaret always insisted on baking cookies for them. The children adored her. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. It made sense now. His deep connection to the orphanage, the generous donation, his quiet presence at the community event. "She would have loved this," Mr. Carter murmured, looking around the orphanage with eyes that were distant but filled with warmth. "Seeing this place filled with laughter, with hope. You've brought something back here, Jasmine." Jasmine swallowed the lump forming in her throat. "You did too, whether you admit it or not." Mr. Carter chuckled. "Perhaps, but a gift means nothing unless it's put to good use, and I can see you've done exactly that." They walked out to the front yard, where volunteers were setting up tables for an upcoming fundraiser. The sense of community, of people coming together for something bigger than themselves, was almost overwhelming. Jasmine watched as a group of kids painted a new sign for the orphanage's entrance. Their small hands were covered in bright colors, their laughter filling the air. "I never thought this would happen," Jasmine admitted. "I thought I was just some girl from the orphanage. I didn't think I could actually make a difference." Mr. Carter turned to her, his expression serious. "The greatest leaders don't start out thinking they're leaders. They just see a need and step forward when no one else does." Jasmine let his words sink in. Maybe that's what she had done. Not because she had planned to. Not because she had wanted recognition, but because she had to. "Jasmine, come help with the banner." She turned to see a group of kids waving at her from the other side of the yard. The fabric banner stretched out between them, waiting to be decorated with their handprints. Jasmine turned back to Mr. Carter, a playful smile on her lips. "Want to leave your mark?" He chuckled. "You know what? I think I do." With slow but steady steps, Mr. Carter walked with Jasmine to the banner. He dipped his hand into a tray of paint, bright golden yellow, just like the color of his favorite biscuit box. And together, they'd pressed their hands onto the fabric. Side by side. A moment, a memory, a legacy. The ripple effect. Over the next few weeks, Jasmine barely had time to breathe. The orphanage renovations were in full swing. The fundraiser was drawing in more donations than expected, and news of the project had started spreading beyond the town. One afternoon, Mrs. Taylor came rushing into the kitchen, where Jasmine was helping prepare meals for the children. "Jasmine, dear, you might want to see this." Curious, Jasmine wiped her hands on a towel and followed her to the office. Mrs. Taylor pulled up a website on her computer. Teenagers' Act of Kindness sparks town-wide movement to revitalize local orphanage. Jasmine's eyes widened as she read the article. It was from a regional news site, highlighting everything that had happened, from her small moment of kindness in the grocery store to the large-scale efforts now taking place. The article praised her leadership, calling her a beacon of hope for the community. Jasmine covered her mouth with her hand. I don't even know what to say." Mrs. Taylor chuckled. "You don't have to say anything, dear. You've already done so much." But the momentum didn't stop there. More donations started pouring in, not just from town, but from people outside the community who had read about the project. Even schools from neighboring towns reached out, offering to send student volunteers. And then came the letter. A second letter. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, just like the first one. No return address, no signature. Jasmine's heart pounded as she carefully opened it. "Dear Jasmine, you continue to inspire. Your kindness has not only transformed the orphanage, it has changed the hearts of those around you. Sometimes the smallest acts create ripples far beyond what we can see. Keep going. With admiration, a friend." Jasmine stared at the letter, emotions crashing over her like a wave. A friend. Was it still Mr. Carter? Or was it someone else now? It didn't matter. Because she understood something now. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about the orphanage. It was about what kindness could do, how it could spread, grow, and create something much bigger than a single moment. Jasmine folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same small box where she kept the first one. Then she stood, shoulders squared, heart steady. This was just the beginning. And she was ready for whatever came next. Rising from the ashes, the weeks that followed felt like a blur. Jasmine was busier than she had ever been in her life. Between organizing volunteers, overseeing renovations, and attending school, she barely had time to sleep. But she didn't care. For the first time, she felt alive. Every morning, she woke up knowing that what she was doing mattered. That she mattered. And the community was responding in ways she never imagined. The orphanage's transformation. The orphanage no longer looked like the tired, forgotten building it had once been. The once peeling walls had been repainted with bright, cheerful colors. The bedrooms, which had been cramped and dull, were now cozy and inviting, filled with new beds, soft blankets, and shelves lined with books. But the most exciting transformation was outside. The playground, the same one Jasmine had played in as a little girl, had been rebuilt. Where there had once been rusted swings and broken slides, there was now a brand new play area, complete with a jungle gym, a sandbox, and even a small garden where the children could grow flowers and vegetables. The laughter of kids playing outside filled the air, and every time Jasmine heard it, she felt like she had won some invisible battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting. She had always thought of herself as just another girl, a nobody. But now she was somebody to these kids, and she wasn't going to let them down. The unexpected offer. One afternoon, as Jasmine was helping to organize a shipment of donated books, she heard someone call her name. Jasmine. She turned to see a woman she didn't recognize, tall, poised, and dressed in a crisp navy suit. She had the kind of polished appearance that made Jasmine instantly nervous. Mrs. Taylor stepped forward, smiling warmly. Jasmine, this is Miss Carmichael. She's from the Bright Futures Foundation. Jasmine wiped her hands on her jeans and reached out to shake the woman's hand. Ah, nice to meet you. The pleasure is mine, Ms. Carmichael said, her sharp eyes studying Jasmine with curiosity. I've heard quite a bit about you. Jasmine blinked. You have? Ms. Carmichael nodded. Your story has gained a lot of attention. We at Bright Futures are always looking for young leaders who are making a difference in their communities. And you, Jasmine, have done something remarkable. Jasmine felt her stomach twist. I just wanted to help. Ms. Carmichael smiled. And that's exactly why we want to help you. Jasmine's eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? Ms. Carmichael pulled a thick envelope from her briefcase and handed it to Jasmine. We'd like to offer you a full scholarship. Jasmine's heart stopped. Do you what? Bright Futures sponsors students who show leadership, resilience, and a drive to give back, Ms. Carmichael explained. You fit all of those qualities and more. We would be honored to help you pursue higher education, any school, any program you choose. Jasmine's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was an official-looking document detailing the scholarship. Her throat tightened. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Ms. Carmichael said gently. Just think about it. But know this, Jasmine, you have a future beyond this town. A future as big as you want it to be. Jasmine swallowed hard. For so long, college had felt impossible, a dream she had forced herself to let go of. But now it was real. A torn heart. That night, Jasmine sat in her small bedroom, staring at the scholarship letter. She should have been overjoyed. But instead, her chest felt heavy. Leaving for college meant leaving the orphanage, leaving the children who looked up to her, leaving everything she had worked so hard to rebuild. And more than anything, It meant leaving Mr. Carter. She hadn't told him about the scholarship yet. She was afraid of what he would say. Would he tell her to go? Would he be disappointed if she left? A part of her wished she could ask him what to do. But she already knew the answer. Deep down, she knew what he would say. And the thought of it terrified her. A late-night talk. Unable to sleep, Jasmine grabbed her hoodie and slipped outside. She found herself walking to the park where she and Mr. Carter often sat and talked. To her surprise, he was already there. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Mr. Carter asked, smiling as he patted the bench beside him. Jasmine sat down, her hands stuffed into her hoodie pockets. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "I got a scholarship," she said quietly. Mr. Carter didn't look surprised. "I heard." Jasmine frowned. "How?" The old man chuckled. "News travels fast in a small town, my dear." Jasmine exhaled sharply. "I don't know what to do." Mr. Carter turned to face her, his expression gentle. "Why do you feel like you have to choose?" Jasmine bit her lip. "Because if I go, I'll be leaving everything behind. The orphanage, the kids, you." Mr. Carter nodded, his gaze distant. "Jasmine, let me ask you something. If Margaret and I had never come to the orphanage all those years ago, if we had never spent time with the children, do you think the love we gave would have disappeared?" Jasmine blinked. "No, of course not." "Exactly." Mr. Carter smiled. "Because love, real love, stays. The impact you've made here won't vanish just because you leave." Jasmine swallowed. "But what if I don't come back?" Mr. Carter took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Then you'll make a difference somewhere else." Tears burned in Jasmine's eyes. "But what if I'm not ready?" Mr. Carter's expression softened. "Jasmine, you were ready the moment you stepped up and changed this town. You just don't see it yet." She let out a shaky breath, wiping her eyes. He was right. She knew he was right. And that was what scared her the most. The decision. The next morning, Jasmine stood in Mrs. Taylor's office, the scholarship letter clenched in her hands. "I'm going," she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Taylor smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I knew you would." Jasmine exhaled. "I'll visit as much as I can, and I'll keep helping from wherever I am." Mrs. Taylor reached across the desk, squeezing her hand. "You'll always have a home here, Jasmine, but you have a whole world waiting for you too." Jasmine nodded. She wasn't just a girl from the orphanage anymore. She wasn't just someone waiting for life to happen to her. She was ready. For whatever came next, for whatever she was meant to become. And this was only the beginning. A future written in stars. The days leading up to Jasmine's departure were a whirlwind of emotions. She was excited, terrified, hopeful. She had spent her whole life in this small town, in the orphanage that had raised her, surrounded by the children who had once been just like her. And now she was leaving it all behind. But she wasn't leaving them behind. She had made a promise, to herself, to Mrs. Taylor, to the children. She would always find a way back. A farewell to home. The orphanage threw her a farewell party. Jasmine didn't expect much, maybe a small gathering, a few cupcakes, a simple goodbye. But when she stepped into the decorated dining hall, her breath caught in her throat. Balloons lined the walls. Banners with messages like, "We love you, Jasmine," and "Come back soon," hung from the ceiling. The children had painted a giant canvas with their handprints and bright, messy letters that read, "Once family, always family." Jasmine blinked back tears as the kids ran up to her, wrapping their arms around her legs. "Do you have to go?" Little Lily asked, her lip trembling. Jasmine knelt down, smoothing Lily's curly hair. "I do, sweetheart. But I'll visit, I promise." "Pinky swear." Jasmine linked her pinky with Lily's. "Pinky swear." Mrs. Taylor wiped away a tear as she stepped forward. "Jasmine, we're so proud of you." Jasmine swallowed the lump in her throat. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Mrs. Taylor smiled. That's not true, dear. You got here all on your own. Jasmine wasn't sure she believed that. But standing in this room, surrounded by love, she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget where she came from. One last visit to the park. The night before she left for college, Jasmine made her way to the park. And just as she had hoped, Mr. Carter was there. Sitting on his usual bench, his cane resting beside him, the soft glow of the street lamp casting shadows over his features. Jasmine sat down beside him, her heart heavy. "I leave tomorrow." Mr. Carter nodded, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "I figured." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the night air cool against Jasmine's skin. Then she spoke. "I don't know what I'm more afraid of, leaving or coming back and realizing everything has changed." Mr. Carter chuckled. "Jasmine, everything will change. That's what life does." Jasmine frowned. "Then how do I hold on to what matters?" Mr. Carter turned toward her, tapping his cane against the ground thoughtfully. "By remembering that change doesn't erase what came before. It builds on it. The love you have for this place, for these people, it doesn't disappear just because you leave." Jasmine exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. "You know," Mr. Carter continued, "when I was younger, I used to look up at the stars and wonder if they ever changed, if they just stayed the same, frozen in time." Jasmine glanced up at the sky, the stars twinkling above them like tiny distant lanterns. "And," he smiled, "and then I learned that stars are always moving, even when we can't see it. They shift, they grow, some even fade, but their light, that never really goes away." Jasmine felt something deep inside her settle. She had been afraid that leaving meant losing the life she had built here. But maybe, just maybe, it meant expanding it, growing into something new, something more. She turned to Mr. Carter, smiling. "I'm glad I met you." The old man patted her hand gently. "The pleasure has been all mine, Jasmine." She hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small wrapped package. "For you," she said softly, placing it in his lap. Mr. Carter's brow lifted as he felt the box beneath his fingertips. Carefully, he unwrapped it. Inside was a box of golden oats biscuits. Mr. Carter let out a warm, rich laugh. "You remembered." Jasmine grinned. "I figured you might need a snack while I'm gone." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You, my dear, are one in a million." Jasmine leaned her head on his shoulder, just for a moment, just to feel the weight of this moment. Then she stood. It was time to go. The journey begins. The morning of her departure, Jasmine stood in front of her foster home, her suitcase by her side. Miss Evelyn hugged her tightly. "You're going to do amazing things, Jasmine. I just know it." Jasmine smiled, blinking back tears. "I hope so." Miss Evelyn cupped her face. "You don't have to hope. You just have to believe." Jasmine nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. As she climbed into the car that would take her to the bus station, she looked out the window one last time. She saw the town, the small, sleepy place that had shaped her. She saw the orphanage in the distance, the home that had raised her, and she saw Mr. Carter, sitting on his usual bench, his cane resting beside him, a box of golden oats in his lap. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. Because Jasmine knew, no matter where she went, no matter how far she traveled, she would always have a home. Epilogue. The letter that changed everything. Months passed. Jasmine settled into college, studying social work, a career she never would have considered before. She called Mrs. Taylor every week. She sent letters to the kids at the orphanage. She even managed to visit once during winter break. But then, one day, a letter arrived. It was from Mr. Carter. Jasmine's hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Jasmine, if you're reading this, it means I have moved on to the next great adventure. Do not be sad. I have lived a long and beautiful life, and meeting you was one of its greatest joys. You once asked me if I was the donor who changed your life. The truth is, I was not the only one. The gift you received was never about the money. It was about belief. Someone somewhere saw your kindness, your heart, your potential, and they wanted to make sure you saw it too. And now you do. That is the true gift, Jasmine. Not money, not scholarships, but knowing your own worth. Take that knowledge and do something extraordinary with it. With all my love, Edward Carter. Tears blurred Jasmine's vision as she clutched the letter to her chest. Mr. Carter was gone, but his words, his legacy, would stay with her forever. She folded the letter carefully, placing it inside the small wooden box where she kept her most treasured memories. Then she wiped her tears and stood tall, because she had a promise to keep. She would make him proud. She would make them all proud. And she would never stop believing in the power of small kindnesses, because sometimes the smallest acts, the ones we never think twice about, are the ones that change everything.